Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. Please take this opportunity to silence your phones if you haven't done so already. And I have also been told that there is a Hyundai with license plates MDI 325, which is alarming intermittently out front of the library. So if that's yours, you may want to check on your vehicle. My name is Zachary. I'm the programs coordinator here at the Northeast Harbor Library. Thank you so much for joining us. And I always like to thank our donors and our collaborators like the MDI Historical Society. They make these programs possible, always free, always year-round. Speaking of, next Wednesday, August 12th, we're hosting architect Thomas Kleiberman for a presentation on what has been referred to as the architecture of the American summer, exploring the design of seaside cottages along the Atlantic coast. So as you can see, these things get, they reserve out pretty quick, so I recommend signing up in advance for that as well. Now to introduce tonight's speaker and say a few words on behalf of the Historical Society, please welcome their Assistant Director, Lisa Tappman-Murray.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. It's a gorgeous evening and this room is packed, and I really am thrilled to see you all, to hear Durlin Lunt talk about his Chebacco article. Thank you, Zach. Thank you to the Northeast Harbor Library for collaborating with us again on our Chebacco Author Talks. We host a variety of public programming year-round all over the island at all of the libraries, and we have an event calendar over there that you're welcome to take, and you can go to our website also, which is mdihistory.org. Our next program is coming up on August 20th. It'll be at the Neighborhood House, and it is our annual meeting, our potluck, and we're having a concert. It's a free public event, and the Bagaduce Northern New England Ensemble will be playing. If you enjoyed tonight's program, I encourage you to become donors. Your support helps us do these public programs, and your support helps to publish Chebacco. Tonight's presenter, Durlin Lunt, is a lifelong resident of the town of Mount Desert. He served on the Mount Desert Select Board from 1975 to 1992, the last 7 as board chair, and later served as the town's municipal manager from 2010 until his retirement in 2025. Durlin's career put him close to a story nearly a century in the making. In 1936, under pressure tied to John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s land acquisitions, the town voted to give up its right-of-way to Otter Creek's harbor, a decision softened only by an informal handshake promise from Rockefeller that the village's fishermen could keep using the waterfront. That promise was never put in writing, and in time, the community found itself cut off from the waterfront they depended on for generations, becoming an island within an island. It took until 1986 for Congress to set a permanent boundary for Acadia National Park, and until 1993 for Otter Creek's harbor access to be partially restored. Decades later, as town manager, Durlin was still working on the issue, pressing for more land to make that access safe. Tonight, Durlin will share the story behind his 2026 Chebacco article, Otter Creek's Lost Waterfront, examining the power dynamics between a small community and a federal agency, and advocating for a modern restoration of the village's working maritime identity, including recent efforts like the 2024 Waterfront Resolution to remedy nearly a century of disenfranchisement. Please join me in welcoming Durlin Lunt.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the Historical Society sponsoring this event, and I appreciate very much all of you coming here this evening. My voice is sort of soft. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? Okay. I'm looking at the size of this crowd, and I'm wondering, you're sure you're all in the right place? No, this isn't karaoke night. We're going to talk about the village of Otter Creek. I'm very aware that we only have an hour or so, so there's a lot to say. Probably will forget, when I get out of here, I'm going to say, I wish I'd said more, why did I forget this? But I also want to leave plenty of time for people to have discussion. So the first thing I'm going to do is just to do a very quick slide presentation that will outline the story in case you haven't read the Chebacco article or if you read it a long time ago, just so that we're all on the same page. The waterfront issue of Otter Creek is a history that has been hiding in plain view for over 90 years. Much of that tradition was oral. It was passed on from the generation of my father to my generation, and then it's being passed on to the generation following me. It's been a long, long road that still is winding into a very uncertain future. Otter Creek's waterfront is not my story, but I was granted the great privilege of being able to write it. And I'm also very pleased that I was able to find a lot of information on it. I lived part of this. As part of my select board experience, I lived through the part of the boundary legislation, which came about in 1986. And towards the end of my tenure on the select board, having the opportunity to, as town manager, to be able to write and to learn more about the whole idea of let's get this right this time. Let's get the waterfront of Otter Creek back to where it is usable, because I cannot imagine another waterfront in the town of Mount Desert passing out of town control into federal properties. To me, it's really inconceivable. And so I want to kind of run you through how that all happened. So let's see, the first thing is, here is the map of Otter Creek, which is up on the screen. And Otter Creek is right there. And it is sometimes called Otter Cove, sometimes it's called Otter Creek. My friend Steve Smith would fry me alive if he's listening tonight and hears me refer to Otter Cove, but I did find maps as far back as 1860 that does call it that. But I'm going to use the inner harbor of Otter Creek is how I'm going to describe it. Ken Burns, one of our great historians of the 21st century, he has done a lot of wonderful presentations. The Civil War was the one he's best known for, but he did baseball, jazz, he did one on prohibition. I mean, he did a lot, and one of his more recent ones is called The National Parks, America's Best Idea. And I agree fully with that the establishment of the national park system under Theodore Roosevelt in 1908 was one of the great acts of preservation and conservation in this country's history. However, I want to also mention that although the establishment of the park system and the creation of the federal parks was one of America's best ideas, there were a lot of bad ideas that went into the formulation of some of these parks, in Acadia in particular. And I also do not want people to think that I'm an overly harsh critic of John D. Rockefeller Jr., because I'm not. I think he did a lot for this island. I think he did a lot for the parks. But sometimes good people do things that have bad consequences. And this is one of those instances. And these consequences are living with us today. I lived a good deal with them during my years on the select board and as the town manager. But so let's just say that we want to discuss how this all came to pass and where we perhaps might go from there. That was the cover of his videos, his introduction of the National Parks, America's Best Idea. Back in the 1880s, there was no Acadia National Park. There was no town of Southwest Harbor. There was a town of Tremont. There were 3 towns on the island at that time. There was Bar Harbor, which is yellow markings up near the top. In the middle, the purple is Mount Desert, and Tremont is down in the green. Southwest Harbor actually didn't come into existence until 1905. It was the last of our towns to split off from the original town of Mount Desert that was established in 1789. So, but at that time, all of that land was municipal land of one of those. And so the big difference between Acadia and the Great Western National Parks was those Western National Parks were all repurposed federal land that was taken out of commerce and repurposed for conservation and preservation. Acadia, on the other hand, has a totally different history. That is the only national park that was primarily acquired by donation. And so that's how we have come to pass a little bit different. We are not a wilderness park. We are considered an urban park. There is no, you can't really always tell where the boundaries of the Acadia National Park are. You have several entrance points, but some of the roads that access parts of Acadia National Park are state highways, and part are like town roads, such as Grover Avenue and Otter Creek. So you never know where you're going to be. Something, you look to your right, you may be on the park, but you're not going to know it. So it's a porous park, and it's a park that really has to, if it's going to be totally successful and live up to its full potential, has to be able to work in a cooperative manner with the communities whose land it encompasses. And most of the time, that works fine. But in this particular instance, is an outlier, and it really didn't. So we'll discuss that a little bit here in a second as well. This is what Otter Creek would have looked like in the 1880s. In the background, you would see Cadillac Mountain. In the foreground, you would see homes in the original road, which is now Route 3 that leads over to Otter Creek. A very different looking village in those days. As you notice, there aren't that many trees, a lot of farmland. And at the time, if you traveled Route 3 in the 1880s, going from Seal Harbor to Bar Harbor, you would be able to very clearly tell that Otter Creek was a waterfront village because the trees and the fields swept down to the sea. And it was very obvious that it had a waterfront and was a waterfront community. Today, a lot of people will pass through, and unless they live here, and maybe even some of the people that live here don't realize that Otter Creek is a waterfront community and has a harbor, because it's not visible. It's all grown up, and it's all under control of Acadia National Park. This is called a fish house, and these fish houses were very prevalent prior to 1936 along both the eastern and the western shores of Otter Cove or Otter Creek Harbor. This was, I believe this was a photograph by LaRue Spiker, who was a correspondent and a writer for the Bar Harbor Times in the 50s up through the 70s and 80s. I can't remember exactly when LaRue passed along, but she was a contemporary. You would have seen dozens of those fish houses. There are only one or two left now, and they're not visible to the naked eye because they're on the park or near the park, and they're stuck up in the woods. That's a better view there. That gives you an idea. That is actually the eastern shore, which was part of the town of Bar Harbor. And that would have been taken around 1890, I believe. So that is the shorefront. If you go down to Grover Avenue in Otter Creek and look across the inner harbor, you can imagine what that would have looked like, totally dotted with those structures. And I've also been told I'm not to call them fish shacks. That is a no-no. I could never go back to Otter Creek again if I did that. They are fish houses. All right. Okay. The story starts with an organization called the Hancock County Trustees of Public Reservations. That organization was the ones that were the acquiring agency of the lands, the private lands, in turn to be donated into Lafayette National Memorial, which became Acadia National Park. So they were the ones that actually started the process of getting the land, deciding which lands should be acquired and which lands should not be acquired, and they had a realtor company, I think the Seal Harbor Real Estate Company it was called, would actually be the broker that would take the lands and transfer them into the park. Here's John D. Rockefeller Jr. He's certainly front and center in this whole story. Now, you've got to indulge me for a second. The worst angels of my nature took over here. So as I was looking at this, I said, well, what if Shakespeare had been alive in 1936 and decided that he would write one of his tragedies on the waterfront acquisition of Otter Creek? So what I imagined is he might have been down looking at lands, and all of a sudden 3 apparitions appeared in front of him. And of course, Mr. Rockefeller was of pure spirit and very public spirited, but I think perhaps we could imagine that he may have been seduced by the 3 witches. The first witch would be called ambition, the second witch was secrecy, and the third witch was consequences. And that is the one that I dealt with most, the consequences of that. So if you could just imagine that. So that's kind of the only snarky thing that I put. But I thought you might enjoy it. Here is where the trouble really started. In 1936, a warrant article was presented to the Mount Desert Board of Selectmen for inclusion into the town meeting of March 1936. This warrant article was a most unusual request. It was at the behest of John D. Rockefeller Jr., and it was asking the town of Mount Desert to vote to extinguish its public access to the harbor of Otter Creek. Now you can imagine, I mean, this was controversial to say the least, but this is where the story to me gets really interesting, because I have dealt, in my experience, I've dealt over 30 years, either as a select board member or as a town manager, with warrant articles in town meetings. And this one is the strangest one that I can ever imagine. If you're familiar with town meeting form of government, the select board sponsors resolutions to go before the voters at the annual town meeting. But there is an intermediate entity called a warrant committee that reviews those articles and makes a recommendation to the town meeting as to whether or not those should pass. This one was reviewed by the 1936 warrant committee, and it was voted unanimously that it should be indefinitely postponed, and that is town meeting language. It means it's dead, it's going nowhere. Yet, within a couple of weeks, that article appeared before the town meeting and was passed unanimously without very much, if any, discussion. So I looked at that and I said to myself, there's something wrong here, because this doesn't happen. I mean, the most routine warrant articles would go through, but anything that's controversial, this, especially when you're giving up access to a village and fishermen, and to go down and work at the businesses, and that fails in the warrant committee by a unanimous vote, yet passes on the floor of town meeting. in a unanimous vote without discussion, that doesn't, to me, that doesn't add up. Makes absolute sense. That's what I got really curious is what happened and why? We'll get to this one in a second. Part of my article that I wrote in the Chebacco was of the oral tradition, the stories that were passed on by the people that actually lived through this period and then told their stories, but they did not write them down. So it's impossible to verify some of the stories that were told about what happened around that town meeting. But I'm old enough now to have known a number of those people that told those stories. And I found, listening to them and looking at the other things that I found their stories to be credible. So I had no problem introducing those into this article. And those were accusations that the pressure was put on the people that worked for the Rockefeller Company. This is 1936. Pop quiz, what was going on in the country in 1936? Yeah, the Depression. And guess where the best jobs were? On Mount Desert Island. And those were jobs that people would die to get. And so the older folks told me and told other people that very subtle pressure was put on them. People would go around and say, Mr. Rockefeller would really appreciate if this article passed. And some of those people work there. Of course, town meetings are open floor. You got to get up there and raise your hand, right? And say, I vote against this article. Well, if I were somebody in 1936 and I worked there, I'm not so sure I would have had the courage to get up and say, I think that this article should be indefinitely postponed. That's just me. Maybe other people are more courageous than that. So, and then there were also Paul Richardson. I don't know if any of you folks know Paul Richardson. He was very active in Otter Creek. He was very active in the town of Mount Desert. I find him to have been a very credible source. Told me that they felt that there were a lot of outer towners who were bussed in to that town meeting. And I don't know how they would have passed through the scrutiny of being able to be participants in that town meeting. But if you take a look at it and think about it logically, how did the select board that unanimously voted to postpone this article, how did the warrant committee that voted unanimously to postpone this article, how did that all of a sudden within weeks turn into a unanimous vote? And I think there were enough. Again, I put that in there not because I could prove it, but because I found the people that said it to be credible. Now, why did John D. Rockefeller want the harbor of Otter Creek? It's not a great harbor. It's open to both summer and winter storms. It drains at low tide. It takes a very hardworking and able person to be able to make a living fishing out there, but people did. So why would it be interested in that? There's not a lot of beautiful scenery around it. But the reason it did is one of his dreams, which the dream did come true, was to build a loop around the park, a motorized road around the park, which is now called the Park Loop Road. And so part of that you have to cross Otter Creek Harbor in order to do that. That road has to go across. Prior to the 1936, there were trestle bridges that was that span. Those trestle bridges allowed an unfettered access of the tides to the harbor. It also allowed small fishing boats, reasonable access in and out. But so why does this stone causeway exist today? And if you look at the picture, do you see those three arches? Those arches were designed to have baffles installed. And the baffles, the idea of the baffles was you could let the harbor drain at low tide. You could let the flats, bake in the sun, and then you could let a limited amount of water to flow back through. Now, those baffles were never installed. It never got to that point, but the bridge was built in that fashion. So why was it built in that fashion? Why would you want to control the tides into Otter Creek Harbor? Now, here's the story. What if I told you that the idea was to turn the inner harbor of Otter Creek into a swimming pool? What would you do? If I said that today, would you consider me to be credible? That is what the goal was, and that's why the bridge or the causeway was built in that fashion, was to turn that into a swimming pool. Now, why did it want to be turned into a swimming pool? Well, this one I do have a verification on. This is one that isn't rumor. I can tell you why, is because the Seal Harbor community, and I don't know if it was summer, resident, or both, were very concerned that there were too many people using the beach. It was overcrowded. So I had, by my friend Steve Smith, who gave me a wealth of archival information, produced a letter from John D. Rockefeller in 1950 to Newton C. Drury, the director of the National Park Service. And that is, and Mr. Rockefeller said at that point, we need to really push forward on getting this turned into the pool because people are complaining it's too crowded at Seal Harbor Beach. That's, again, that died at that point. But as late as 1950, that was really a viable position, or a very viable prospect. Now, again, this is just myself, but I remember as a young boy in the early 1950s, my mother taking me to Seal Harbor Beach. And I'd go there in August, and yeah, there were people there, but it didn't strike me as being something that was overcrowded in those days. Well, obviously there were people there, but don't you want people on a beach? But it didn't seem to me that they were festering whores that were all running that beach. So that is the bridge is really kind of the consequence that I have had to live with during my time as the town manager, and what can be done about the causeway to restore tidal flushing into that area, because there are those that believe that the lack of a clean tidal flow has caused that to species such as clams and things like that cannot exist in that harbor anymore with that restricted tidal flow, and green crabs that are great predators come in and eat all of the clams. I'm not a biologist, so I'm not going to talk to that, but again, I find that to be credible. I'm sure that probably climate change plays a role in that as well, but I don't think you could totally blame the condition of Otter Creek Harbor purely on climate change. I think tidal flow has to be part of that. Okay, that is, you can't read it, but that's the Rockefeller letter to Newton C. Drury in 1950. So I paraphrase what it is. I'm not going to read it all to you because I don't even think of my readers I could read it off the screen. But that is the actual letter. This is the resolution of the select board that I believe was in 2024 to the National Park Service to become interested in perhaps helping us restore Otter Creek to the best of our ability as a working waterfront. So that is a 4-point plan that would include addressing the issues of the causeway, donation of more land back to the town of Mount Desert so that we can enhance the landing area, down at Grover Avenue and make that more usable, because you have to, if you're going to launch a kayak or a small skiff, you either have to back down or back up, and that's pretty dangerous to try to do that. So that is beauty of this, is that it's now become, or soon will become, part of the town of Mount Desert's comprehensive plan. Therefore, from now on forward will be official policy of the town of Mount Desert. And that is important, because as managers change and select boards change, interests change. But this will be part of it. And people, before you do any warrant articles to the town meeting, everything must adhere to the town's comprehensive plan. So nothing should be done in Otter Creek that does not do that. So that's an important, I think, distinction. And I think very pleased that the board, and that was towards the end of my tenure, that board passed that resolution, and it will be the law of the town of Mount Desert from this time going forward. I just want to give you a kind of a quick, before we turn this over, how are we doing for time, Zach?
We got about 25 minutes.
Okay, then I'm going to go really quick on this one. I think it's important to realize how difficult it is to work with an organization such as the National Park. And that's not because of any ill will or anything sinister about it, but it's got so many layers of bureaucracy, you never know who can give you the right answer. Do you deal with the park administration locally? Do you deal with the regional office in Boston? Do you deal with the National Park Service in Washington, D.C.? Do you deal with your congressional representatives? Wow. So if you want to get something like this done, it's very, very difficult. My solution that I had advanced at the time, and I think was pretty well agreed upon by the Board of Selectmen, was that we should consider reopening the boundary legislation to see what amount of the land that was acquired in 1936 might be returned to the town of Mount Desert. This is something that I cannot take a real strong advocacy position on, because of my unique position of still living in the town of Mount Desert, have been the chief administrator of the town, and still a lifetime member of the International City Managers Association, bound by its code of ethics, that I'm not supposed to undertake any activity that might use my influence might be used to affect policies of the town of Mount Desert. So this is about as far as I'm going to go on that. Certainly I'm interested in it, certainly feel writing about it, but as far as being the strongest advocate for it, it's probably not in the cards. But it's there. And another thing I think we do, right now the town is asking for just enough land to enhance the facility, the launching facility. But I'm thinking, Robert Kennedy, when he ran for president in 1968, said some people see things as they are and ask why. Others dream things that never were and ask why not. So I asked the people of Mount Desert to take a look at this. If we are going to open up that boundary legislation, what lands should perhaps be returned to the town of Mount Desert and to the village of Otter Creek? And I look at that now. Remember, the only reason that the shores of Otter Creek Harbor were acquired during the 36 vote, or it was purchased by Rockefeller, was to build that swimming pool. Well, that swimming pool was never built. So what is the rationale now for holding on to those particular pieces of land? Again, that is going to be the responsibility of the town of Mount Desert, is to decide is how far they want to go as far as that land reclamation process is concerned. And You know, as a citizen, I might have my opinions, but that's all it is. So I'm not going to stand up here and say we should ask for this, ask for that. That's up to you people that are voters in the town of Mount Desert or summer residents of the town of Desert. That's a decision you need to make, not I. So thank you very much for your attention on this. And I certainly would like to leave time for any discussions that you might have on it. Yes, sir.
So, Durlin, was there any contemporaneous reporting in the Ellsworth paper, or the Bangor paper, the Harvard paper in 1936 about that town meeting and about what all the machinations?
I did not find anything. That's not to say it wasn't there, but I did not find it. It's interesting, when I started this whole process, the only thing I could find was a 2015 story or book actually written by a fellow named Drury, who wrote the Waterfront of Otter Creek. And he laid this whole story out. You know, the whole thing. I said, wow, you know, I wasn't really familiar with that too much. I knew some of it tangentially. So that was the only written source I could have. But Steve Smith had a tremendous amount of primary documentation that he gave me to write this article. And that's where it was. But you know, now, if you go Google Otter Creek now, I can assure you, you're going to find a lot more information down there. In fact, you're going to be flooded by information. I suppose if my friend here at the Islander writes a story, that will go online, and there'll be more stories about that. So they'll ripple out like concentric circles. But yes, very little. And the whole thing. Another quick point was that I understand through that article that I quoted from you by Dorr, is that Rockefeller's legal team wasn't really sure that that vote was on solid ground. There was some question about whether the town even had a right to extinguish its own right of way. And they told him that if that were challenged, that vote could be on jeopardy. I'm not on jeopardy, in jeopardy. Excuse me on that. But the thing is, again, that was never challenged. There was some talk about perhaps getting a legal opinion on that, but that never happened. So again, that's whole part of the mystery of why something that was so controversial that could have been challenged wasn't challenged. And I don't have the thing about it. It could have been that there was a fear that it would be sort of like bringing a knife to a gunfight. If you're going up against the legal team of the richest person in America, that's probably going to be something that's going to be pretty difficult to litigate. Yes, so thank you for that question. Yes.
Comment and a question from online. Cynthia says, thank you so much. I had heard my great-grandfather and his half-brother talk about it, but it's great to see it laid out. And Patty asks, who owned the land along the water before this happened? The town or the fish house owners?
The fish house owners owned it. And here's the other part that I said I wouldn't take up too much. I do want to mention this, it's important, that there was enough of a controversy that there was some worry about what the repercussions, of this might be. So Rockefeller built another access road under the Park Loop Road that they could get to the fish houses. And he also said, if you sell those fish houses to me, I will promise that upon my death, when these lands go into Acadia National Park, that the right to remain as fishers in these buildings will be preserved. And so, of course, in 1936, that's money. He certainly would be willing to pay enough money to entice them to do that. They did sell those, and they did continue to work down there through 1959 when he passed away. Now, the problem is that when those deeds went over to the park, that the covenants that he had expressed of verbal agreement to were never included in the deeds. So it certainly didn't take long after his death for those fish houses to be ripped down. It was a fairly quick process. Out they went. And so that's another bone of contention on that.
Over there.
Yes.
If that farmer was returned to the town and became active working farmer, how would that affect the bridges on Waterfront Road?
It shouldn't impact them at all unless the town wanted to acquire lands that out as far as the Park Loop Road. Probably there, again, I shouldn't speculate, but it would be likely that any acquisitions that they would want to continue would be far less than going out that far. But what would happen is that land, if it came back into the town, that would be subject to all of the environmental regulations today, including shoreland zoning. So there would have to be some sort of studies done to say if that land came back in, including that land from Grover Avenue back up towards Route 3, if that did come back into the town, what exactly could we do with it, given the total law, the totality of the laws today? We know at one time there were houses and farms up on that land. To what degree that could be repurposed for, affordable workforce housing, I don't know. But those are things that you would certainly want to have some very good studies done before you made any sort of a proposition to reacquire those lands. Yes.
The boundary line between the town of Mount Desert and Bar Harbor bisects on the road. And has Bar Harbor expressed similar interest in acquiring the property back as the town of Mount Desert?
No, the town of Bar Harbor, at least when I was the manager, had not expressed any interest on having the eastern side of the cove returned, which was theirs. Right. Perhaps if that got to be a more serious effort and it progressed a little longer, they might be involved. But I think that it seems to me like the town of Bar Harbor has been involved in a number of issues. So probably the eastern side of Otter Cove was probably not on their highest priority.
I have a very quiet voice, so I'll stand up. I'm descendant from one of those families that owned property there, and maybe I can be helpful.
Yes.
Because we've always understood and known that there was a lease grant to us to continue, and including a lobster pound by Johnson Jr. And that perpetuated for quite a bit of time. We were one of those very early families there.
Yes.
Our business was pounding. And actually, when I look at that design, it looks very much like Norwood's Cove, another one of our pounds, or Winter Harbor. And I wonder, perhaps we're missing something we don't see anymore about fishing and lobstering practices as they have historically been done. So we've always, I was
Thank you,
very directly. There was a great deal of thanks because he was willing to continue to lease to allow the continuation of lobstering. So I just want to be clear because I'm hearing something quite different from you and I'm sort of surprised.
Yes. Thank you. Because the Otter Creek is a jigsaw puzzle and some of the pieces just don't fit. Yeah.
First of all, just thank you so much for this presentation. Multiple generations of my family, 7 generations of my family fished out of Otter Creek and the Outer Harbor. And growing up, we always had a boat there. And I'm curious, on the Bar Harbor side, there was a sort of rudimentary boat launch in a parking area.
Yeah.
Is that still open? What's the status of that area? Is it still a place where people launch boats?
Not so familiar with the Bar Harbor side. We did restore the landing, on the western side of that. Another thing that happened during that time when the fish houses were coming down, although it took several years later, there were some nice dock areas that came in, and those were taken down as well. I have a letter from Ann Funderburk, who was descended from one of the original trustees, talking about the whole acquisition process and how the goal of the original trustees was to not interfere with the culture and commerce of Otter Creek, that no land should be acquired that were going to impact the village in that regards. So up until 1936, it was a fairly smooth process because the lands that were brought in were not terribly controversial. After that, the whole rules of the game changed. Yes, sir.
What happened to the scientists that met 5 years ago in the church at Otter Creek, and they were going to come up with a plan to do something about the inner harbor?
Yes, we do have actually the ability through our town's, they call it sustainability committee, which is actually a conservation committee in other towns. We actually do have money set aside, or we did, I shouldn't say now, here it is, I'm speaking for the town, I'm sorry about that. But we did at that particular time have money to do some water testing, that we could look in there and see exactly what the condition of that harbor is. And also, as you know, George, there had been a wastewater treatment plant down there which has been turned into a pump station, which spewed a lot of chemicals and stuff out into the harbor. We believe that there's no problem there, but we could do that, or that could be done as well. So again, there's so many moving parts to this. So I guess it's the idea of where do you start? Where do you go from there? But I think my position, what I wanted to do simply is not to suggest what needs to be done over there. What my goal this presentation is to give you, as best that I understand it, the history of that whole process, and let the town and the people decide what needs to be done as a consequence of that. So, yes.
Elaine online asks, is there any chance the residents of Otter Creek will ever get their waterfront back? I wish, but I don't see it happening.
There's always a chance. Yeah, there's always a chance. But again, you've got to be willing, the people have got to be willing to do some things that are going to be difficult. You're going to have to go in front of your congressional delegations, because they're the key to opening up the boundary legislation, which to me is the only way I see that you could possibly do this, is to redraw. I found that my appearances before the congressional delegation were mixed. They certainly got a lot of sympathy, much more sympathy than action. But but there is elections coming, and people do change. I think it's an issue that needs to be kept in front of them at all time, because I was like to use the story, back in the days when the Western parks were founded, and a lot of that land that eventually became Western parks, some of that actually got returned to the indigenous people, that the federal government had taken lands away from them, put them on reservations. Some of those lands have got restored. So if that could happen, perhaps this could happen as well. But again, it's going to be tough. There's a lot of work that's going to have to be done. Yes.
Gail asks, can't it be asked that the causeway be replaced by a bridge so the tidal flow can return?
That has been a suggestion. Of course, the problem is it's on the National Register of Historic Places. It would be very, very, I think the first thing, take the path of least resistance. I think what should be done is that there should be studies done to see if that bridge can be redone. Leave the bridge there, but also to allow a greater flow of water through. That, that's an engineering question, which I don't know, but that would be something that I think would be possible. The other thing is, maybe that is an idea. The problem is, again, why they built the bridge the way it was is because so many of the trestle bridges got washed out by the storms. And so they would be there 4 or 5 years and the bridge would wash out, another one up. But technology is a little better these days. Perhaps you could build a trestle-style bridge that could stand up to those storms. Certainly, it's worth talking about, I think. Wow, that's great. Anybody else got any questions? Yes, sir.
Professor, thank you again so much for enlightening us on the story here. There's many levels to this, but as far as the property acquisition, recognizing there was this unusual warrant in 1936, but the actual transfer of the property itself, when the Seal Harbor Realty Company, as the guys from Rockefeller, was out buying these lots, have you found any evidence of impropriety in the deeds?
No, the transactions were perfectly legal as far as I can tell, and perfectly ethical. The only thing that I found within the deeds was for the fish houses that the covenants on permanent tenancy never got into those deeds, and that's why the fish houses are gone. But that's the only one. Otherwise, no, I think the property transfers were perfectly above board.
Thank you, Durlin.
Thank you very much.